Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into, well, a really fascinating intersection of law, spirituality, and some pretty ancient texts.
Yeah, we've got source material provided by you, our listener, about a specific legal case. Haltom v. City of Henderson TN Police Department.
And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to explore this material. It focuses on the plaintiff's claim of alleged constitutional violations by the police department, but it comes with a very unique perspective.
Absolutely. A really unique perspective. The plaintiff views these alleged legal issues as having these profound spiritual and historical roots, and they're drawing heavily on interpretations of the biblical text of 1 Samuel 8 and also the Zoharic mystical teachings.
Okay, so the sources you've shared include, let's see, a legal filing or motion, references to some correspondence, a letter, and then these interpretations of scripture, the Zohar, and even, interestingly, a proposed AI-generated podcast video.
Right, called Hierarchy's Hidden Roots.
Hierarchy's Hidden Roots, yeah.
And just a quick note on sources. There was a primary article mentioned, the deliberation of kingship. We couldn't access that one. So just to be clear, we're focusing only on the insights into 1 Samuel 8 and the Zohar as they're actually presented in the material you sent us.
Got it. So this isn't going to be like your standard legal breakdown. It's much more about understanding the deep interpretive lens the plaintiff is using here. The goal for you, listening in, is to get a handle on this perspective, where it comes from, and why the plaintiff views these alleged violations with, frankly, such gravity.
Okay, let's start maybe by unpacking the core source material. So the central claim brought by the plaintiff, Ambassador Josiah Haltom, is that there have been egregious constitutional violations by the Henderson police.
And they describe these pretty strongly, not just, technical slips, but fundamental civil rights breaches. They seem to be pushing back hard against any idea that these could be dismissed as, like, moot points or frivolous paperwork.
Exactly. That seems to be a potential defense framing they're anticipating. Instead, the plaintiff frames these alleged violations as symptoms of something deeper, more insidious. They talk about certain contrived, snaring forces of structural violence and a spiritual wickedness that seemingly influences public agendas.
Wow. So that perspective suggests this spiritual imbalance isn't just a backdrop. It's seen as maybe actively underlying the violations themselves and any attempts to minimize them.
That's precisely the implication, which leads us naturally into the biblical foundation the plaintiff uses to understand all this 1 Samuel 8.
Right, this is where it gets really interesting. The source material presents 1 Samuel 8 as this kind of turning point. The Israelites, they're unhappy with the prophet Samuel's sons, and they demand a human king. They say they want to be like all the nations.
Effectively rejecting God's direct rule over them.
Yeah, moving away from that model.
And the text, as it's presented in the source, is really clear. God tells Samuel, look, this isn't about you, Samuel. He says, they have rejected me from being king over them. It's framed as this fundamental shift away from divine guidance towards a purely human-run system.
But even though they're rejecting him, God tells Samuel to warn them. Warn them very specifically about the ways of the king. The Hebrew word there is mishpat.
Mishpat, yeah. It can mean judgment or policies, kind of the operational rules. It implies these policies, the king's way of doing things, would drastically change their lives and not in a good way.
And Samuel really lays it out, doesn't he? Using that Hebrew word lakach, to take, over and over.
Repeatedly. The king will take their sons for the army, for his chariots, take their daughters to be perfumers and cooks, take the best of their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves.
And give them to his servants.
Right. And he'll take a tenth, a tithe of their grain and wine, take their servants, their best cattle, donkeys, even a tenth of their flocks for his own use.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
And the warning ends really starkly. Samuel says they will become the king's slaves. The word is Eve, and when they eventually cry out to God because of this king they chose, God won't answer, because they made that choice.
So the core idea being pulled from this in the source material is that this ancient story isn't just history. It's seen as a kind of timeless blueprint for the dangers of, well, unchecked human power.
Exactly. It shows, according to this view, how turning away from divine guidance inevitably leads to oppression, this systematic taking of freedom, property, even people themselves.
And the source connects this directly, doesn't it, to the alleged violations in the Henderson case?
It draws a straight line.
Yeah.
These alleged constitutional smears are viewed as sort of modern examples of that same ancient pattern of taking from the people. The argument presented is that it's rooted in human authority going off track, deviating from divine principles or, a higher moral code.
So it links the ancient warning directly to today's situation. The core problem, in this view, is a rejection of divine kingship.
It definitely elevates the whole thing. Seeing alleged modern legal issues as mirroring this deep historical and spiritual pattern of, usurpation, described thousands of years ago, it turns these alleged violations from just legal disputes into symptoms of a much older, maybe even spiritual problem with purely human governance.
Okay, so that's the first Samuel 8 piece. Now, the Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism, you said, that adds another layer.
Yes, a crucial spiritual dimension, kind of complementing the picture from 1 Samuel 8. From the Zoharic viewpoint presented in the sources, God is still the ultimate sovereign. God removes kings and sets up kings.
Okay.
And interestingly, the source highlights that even evil kings are seen as being put in place by God. But why? According to the correction process of the world.
So the idea is that even corrupt leaders are somehow part of a bigger divine plan, maybe to show where things need fixing.
That's the interpretation laid out in the material, yes. The Zohar is shown to contrast righteous leaders who are humble, serve God and the people, seek unity, act with wisdom, morality, and importantly, are with the light, contrast them with corrupt authority.
And how does the Zohar, or at least the interpretation provided, describe that corrupt authority?
Well, it's seen potentially as representing like reincarnations of oppressive figures, maybe biblical pharaohs who are always seeking stronger control. They are leaders explicitly described as not with the light. And the source material even includes this specific, quite striking detail from the Zohar interpretation. The idea that major leaders being without children could be a spiritual sign, signifying a lack of continuation, implying maybe they're waiting to be punished and be terminated.
Okay. That definitely resonates with the plaintiff's language about spiritual wickedness influencing agendas.
It lines up very closely. So another key insight drawn from the Zohar here is that the alleged actions in the case, they aren't seen as random. They're viewed as aligning with this Zoharic idea of leaders who are not with the light.
Okay.
The claim seems to be that these actions are part of that larger correction process, revealing where spiritual repair is desperately needed. This adds a pretty significant theological backing to the plaintiff's claims, suggesting the legal fight itself is part of exposing and hopefully correcting a kind of spiritual darkness.
And by introducing the Zohar, the plaintiff is, within this framework, sort of positioning themselves as an agent of light, right? Someone helping facilitate that necessary correction.
That certainly seems to be the implication woven through the source material. And the Zoharic perspective, as presented, also offers guidance on responding to these perceived corrupt leaders. It suggests the focus shouldn't just be on, say, reacting to lies and fake news, but maybe more on things like praying for peace and holding on to certainty in God's plans.
Okay, which then brings us to that AI-generated podcast video you mentioned earlier, Hierarchy's Hidden Roots.
Unpacking 1 Samuel 8 with key Zohar light for divine inspiration. Yeah, that's the full title mentioned.
So what's its role here, according to the source material?
It's described literally as the intellectual bridge. It's meant to connect these ancient texts, 1 Samuel 8, the Zohar, directly to the legal claims being made today.
And its main point, basically, is that problems in society, problems in government, they have deep spiritual roots.
That's the core argument presented. The podcast apparently frames these alleged constitutional smears not just as secular legal problems, but as outward signs of this spiritual misalignment, a rejection of divine order that naturally leads to the oppressive ways of the king, just like 1 Samuel 8 warned.
So its function, especially in presenting it to the court, is to be a kind of interpretive key, helping to explain the nature of the alleged violations, the perceived motive, which the source describes as a spiritual intent, a turning away from right principles and the sheer gravity of it all, from the plaintiff's very specific, deeply held viewpoint. It pushes beyond just a secular legal reading.
Right, and that helps explain why it's specifically labeled as circumstantial evidence. Its value isn't claimed to be proving a specific factual event happened, like direct evidence would.
Instead, it provides context, an interpretive framework.
Precisely. It's submitted to show the plaintiff's deep conviction that these alleged actions are fundamental attacks rooted in this spiritual understanding. It explains why they're seen as serious civil rights violations, not just moot points or procedural errors.
So the evidence aims to give insight into the plaintiff's understanding of the spiritual intent they perceive behind the actions and the level of spiritual and societal harm they believe resulted.
Yeah, and calling it circumstantial evidence seems like a deliberate legal strategy to get this whole spiritual framework onto the court's radar, to have it considered as part of the narrative.
Okay, so the podcast explains the framework. But the plaintiff didn't stop at legal filings and videos. The source also talks about a very unique, tangible action they took, tying directly into this spiritual perspective: the offer of Zohar books.
Yes, this apparently happened on Memorial Day, May 26, 2025. The source says the plaintiff offered a significant number of pocket-sized Zohar books from the Kabbalah Center International directly to the Henderson Police Department.
Wow.
And the stated wish was to share them with every police person and all individuals connected to the HPD's operations. Basically, everyone involved.
And doing this on Memorial Day, the source frames it as a gift of light and seeds of tikkun olam.
Right, and tikkun olam is a really key concept here. The source material explains it well. Its common modern meaning is often about social action, repairing the world in a practical sense.
But the Kabbalistic meaning, especially in the Lurianic tradition the source seems to reference, is much deeper, much more cosmic.
Exactly. It's about repairing the very fabric of creation by gathering up these holy sparks of divine light that were scattered when, according to the myth, the divine vessels shattered. It's done through righteous actions.
So it's about restoring cosmic brokenness, preventing chaos, protecting vulnerable people from oppressive systems,
Yeah.
all by gathering these sparks.
That's the idea. So within that framework, offering these Zohar books isn't just, a nice gesture or simple charity. It's presented as a profound spiritual initiative.
Okay.
The source says it's intended to foster introspection, wisdom, and a renewed commitment to the highest principles of service and integrity within the police department itself.
So it's framed as a way to tackle that perceived spiritual wickedness head on, by bringing light, trying to fix what is broken spiritually inside the institution. I think the letter mentions something like, instead of solely pursuing legal remedies, what is most needed is a gift of light.
That's a direct quote highlighted in the source, yes. It positions this spiritual action as complementary to the legal one, maybe even suggesting it's more fundamental, a kind of spiritual due process, seeking internal change, internal rectification.
And offering it to everyone connected to the HPD, that suggests a focus on systemic change, right? Trying to infuse light into the whole system, not just holding individuals accountable.
That seems to be the scope and intent described. So it appears from the sources that the legal action and this very unique spiritual offering are seen as two sides of the same coin for the plaintiff.
Two different approaches working towards the same overarching goal.
Yeah, the goal being to bring about repair in a system where authority is perceived to have strayed from divine principles and hopefully prevent similar issues in the future.
Okay, so bringing this deep dive, toward a close, we've really explored a case where alleged legal violations are being interpreted through this incredibly powerful lens of ancient biblical warnings and these deep mystical spiritual teachings.
The core connection, as the plaintiff argues it in the sources we looked at, is that modern constitutional smears, as they call them, are basically echoes of those dangerous ways of the king from 1 Samuel 8.
Right.
And that these stem from a spiritual wickedness described through the Zohar, representing a fundamental break from divine authority. And that break requires not just legal fixes, but actual spiritual repair, tikkun olam.
This case and the source material you shared with us, it really does challenge us, doesn't it? To think beyond just the usual definitions of legal disputes. It asks us to consider if maybe societal problems, even legal ones, could be seen as having much deeper roots.
Whether those roots are historical, philosophical, or, as argued so strongly here, spiritual.
Yeah. So maybe something for you, our listener, to think about after this deep dive. If authority is seen by some, like this plaintiff, as being fundamentally rooted in divine principles, how does its perceived failure through these alleged violations change how we understand something like civil rights?
And what does it really mean for how we pursue justice when alleged wrongs get interpreted not merely as legal problems, but as actual spiritual breaches that require, from this perspective, a kind of mystical repair?